Hey, in this video, we're diving into Charlie Munger's wisdom on how compounding really works. I've broken it down into two quick parts for you. The recap. First, we'll give you a high-level summary of his main points so you can get the big picture right away. The legend himself. After that, I'll play the actual footage of Charlie's speech so you can hear it straight from the source. This is the recap.
All right, let's talk about compounding. It's a word you hear all the time, right? But here's the thing, almost everyone gets it completely wrong. We think it's some kind of magic trick for getting rich quick. Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain and see what it really is. And I'll give you a hint. The secret to its incredible power is, well, it's so boring, it's actually brilliant.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. We've all been sold this fantasy, haven't we? This idea of effortless, crazy growth. You know, you picture the numbers just multiplying in your account while you're off sipping a margarita on a beach. But that image, it leaves out the single most important part of the entire process.
Okay, so let's get right to it. It's time to separate the fantasy from the reality. And I'll tell you right now, the truth isn't nearly as glamorous, but it's 1,000 times more powerful if you've got the guts to stick with it. I want you to really read these words because they are so important. You've got relentless accumulation. Okay, makes sense. Over time. Yep, got it. But then there's the killer phrase, uninterrupted by nothing. That right there, that's the secret sauce. And it's the exact reason almost nobody ever gets to see the real power of compounding. So check this out, $1,500. What is that? It seems kind of random, right? Well, that's what a single dollar, just $1, turns into after 40 years of compounding at 20% a year. Now look, is a 20% return likely? No way. It's super rare. But that's not the point. The point is to see what happens when you just let the math do its thing, completely, totally undisturbed. Now this really puts it into perspective. Look at the difference here. You might think, 15%, 20%, what's 5% between friends? Well, over 40 years, it's the difference between $267 and $1,500. It is massive, but that huge gap only opens up if the process is left completely alone year after year after year. So if the process is so simple, why doesn't everyone do it? Well, that brings us to the real villain of this story. And it's not the stock market, it's not the economy, it's not bad luck. The enemy is sitting right between your ears. It's our own brain, hardwired to screw this whole thing up. I mean, we've all heard some version of this, right? But it's that last word that trips everyone up, unnecessarily. What does that even mean? Well, our brain is a little gremlin that's constantly whispering in our ear, hey, you should interrupt this. It's necessary. In fact, it's a genius idea. So, in a perfect world, this is the dream. This beautiful, smooth curve going up and to the right. You pick something good, an investment, a skill, a relationship, and you just let it ride. Year 1, year 10, year 20, each year's gains build on the last. It's slow at first, then it starts to accelerate. It's perfect. But you know what's coming, don't you? Bam! This is reality. This is what we do. We get bored, we panic. We see something new and shiny over there, and we just have to chase it. We tell ourselves that all this frantic activity, all this changing and tweaking, that it's progress. But it's not. And here is the absolutely brutal cost of that interruption. Every single time you jump ship, you don't just hit pause. No, it's much worse. You hit reset. You completely restart the clock. All those years, 10, maybe 20 years of slow, steady progress, gone, wiped out. And you're right back at the bottom of that slow, painful climb. And here are the usual suspects, the classic ways we shoot ourselves in the foot. Chasing the hot new thing. Yep. Switching your entire strategy every 12 months? Classic. Giving up on a skill because you're not a rock star after 6 weeks? We've all been there. And this last one is a killer. Selling a fantastic asset just because the price went up a little? Every single one of these feels so smart in the moment, but they are the mortal enemies of long-term success. All right, so this leads us to an idea that feels, well, it feels completely wrong. What if the secret to winning big wasn't about making brilliant moves? What if the real superpower was just doing nothing? What if the whole game is about patiently not messing up? I love this quote. It's so simple and so profound. All the money was made by sitting on your hands, not by frantically clicking buttons. The real work isn't the research or the buying. The real, grindingly difficult work is forcing yourself to sit still when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to do something. So, okay, how do you actually do this? You build a system, but it's not a system for finding genius ideas. It's a system for avoiding catastrophic mistakes. It's a don't be an idiot checklist. You avoid things that can wipe you out, like crazy debt. You make a blood oath not to panic sell when things look scary. You stay in your lane and don't gamble on things you don't understand. And the last rule is the most important. You follow these rules no matter what. And the reason you have to be so defensive is because compounding is a double-edged sword. It works both ways. The good stuff, knowledge, trust, good habits, it builds you up, but it's slow, like building a cathedral brick by brick. The bad stuff, though, debt, lies, a bad reputation, oh man, that stuff compounds against you like wildfire. It can burn down in a day what took you a decade to build. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because this whole idea, it's not just about your bank account. Not at all. This is a fundamental law of the universe. It applies to literally everything you do. I mean, just think about learning any difficult skill. The first year or two, it's a total mess. You feel lost, confused, you don't know what you're doing. But if you just keep showing up, if you don't quit, by year 10, you start to see the patterns. By year 20, you've developed an intuition, a gut feeling. And after 40 years, it's like breathing. It's just automatic. That's compounded knowledge. And you can see this everywhere you look. Your knowledge base, right? The mental models you use to see the world. The deep trust you have with your family or oldest friends. That didn't happen in a weekend. Your skills, your reputation for being reliable, even your health. All of these are the direct result of small, consistent actions compounded over a very, very long time. Okay, here's a number for you, 2,000. What do you think that is? That's how many books you could read in your life if you did one simple thing. Read for 30 minutes a day, every day, for 50 years. Think about that. A tiny, almost laughably small habit, when left uninterrupted, creates a knowledge base that is just staggering. So, ultimately, this whole thing boils down to a fundamental choice. It's a choice between two very different paths. One path is exciting, it's frantic, it's full of action. The other, well, it's kind of boring, it's patient, it's relentlessly consistent. The first one feels like you're making progress. The second one is progress. And this chart just shows you why this is so damn hard for us humans. Look at the first 10 years, barely a blip. The next 10 years, a little better, but still nothing to write home about. This 20-year stretch is what I call the great filter. It's where almost everybody gives up because it feels pointless. But if you can just survive that, if you can just stick with it, look what happens in that last decade. It just goes vertical. That's when it looks like magic to all the people who quit back in year 15. I mean, let that one just sink in for a second. Extraordinary results. Where do they come from? Not from extraordinary actions. They come from ordinary actions, simple stuff, but, and this is the whole game, sustained over uncommon periods of time. The secret isn't being a genius. The secret is having the patience, the temperament to do the boring, sensible thing for way, way longer than anyone else. So I'll leave you with this one question to really chew on. When you look at your own life, your career, your finances, your skills, what are you building? Are you building a long resume of frantic activity? Or are you building a quiet, powerful, uninterrupted chain of compounding? It's a choice we all have to make.
Most people think compounding is about money growing in a bank account. They imagine numbers multiplying while doing nothing, some magical force that makes millionaires overnight. That's not compounding. That's a fantasy sold to people who don't understand mathematics. Here's what compounding actually is. It's the relentless accumulation of small advantages over time, interrupted by nothing. It works on everything: money, knowledge, habits, mistakes, stupidity, and relationships. The math doesn't care what it's compounding, it just needs consistency and time. The trouble is, very few people can sit still long enough to let it work. They interrupt it constantly, switching strategies every year, chasing new opportunities, convinced that action equals progress. Then they wonder why someone doing less than them ends up with more. Walk into any room of ambitious people and ask them about compounding. They'll nod knowingly, maybe quote Einstein's apocryphal line about it being the eighth wonder of the world. Then they'll proceed to violate every principle of compounding in their actual behavior, because understanding a concept intellectually is worthless without the temperament to apply it. 20% annual returns sound boring compared to someone bragging about doubling their money in 6 months. Nobody gets excited about 20%. Nobody writes articles celebrating the person who steadily, quietly, compounds at 20% for 40 years while avoiding catastrophic mistakes. But here's the uncomfortable truth. 20% compounded over 4 decades turns $1 into $1,500. That same person chasing explosive gains, they usually end up with less than the market average because they interrupted their compounding by being clever. The mathematics is elementary, yet almost nobody internalizes it. A small edge, sustained without interruption over sufficient time, produces results that appear miraculous to people who don't understand exponential functions. That's not luck, that's just math being allowed to work. Consider the actual numbers from real track records. $1 invested in Berkshire Hathaway in 1964 grew to roughly $38,000 by 2022. Not through spectacular annual gains every year, but through avoiding terrible mistakes and letting 20% compound for nearly 6 decades. Meanwhile, most professional investors who tried to be more clever ended up with far less. The gap between 20% and 15% seems trivial in any single year. Over 40 years, that 5% difference means ending with $1,500 versus $267 from the same starting dollar. Small differences in rate matter, but only if you never interrupt the process. Most people achieve neither consistent rates nor consistent time. The first rule of compounding gets quoted constantly but understood rarely. Never interrupt it unnecessarily. Those 3 words contain more wisdom than most investing books. Yet people ignore them because the advice sounds too simple. What does unnecessary interruption look like? Selling a wonderful business because it went up, switching careers because the current one feels boring, abandoning a learning path because progress seems slow, trading a reliable relationship for an exciting new one. Every single interruption restarts the clock. Berkshire Hathaway compounded at roughly 20% annually for nearly 6 decades, not by making brilliant moves constantly, but by making a few good decisions and then refusing to interrupt them. The wealth came from sitting, not from trading. Here's what actually happened in that track record. 15 decisions mattered, maybe 20. The rest of the time was spent doing nothing, waiting, resisting the urge to act. Hyperactivity would have destroyed the compounding because each trade introduces friction, taxes, mistakes, and most importantly, interruption. The great irony is that doing less produces more, but human nature makes inactivity feel irresponsible. People create busy work to justify their existence, to feel productive, to demonstrate activity to others. They trade compounding for the appearance of competence, then wonder why they never achieve extraordinary results. Here's what most people miss entirely. Compounding works in both directions, and negative compounding destroys wealth faster than positive compounding creates it. Lose 40% one year, gain 50% the next, you're still down. The mathematics of loss is brutal. Bad habits compound. Make one poor decision, and it becomes easier to make the next one. Miss one day of learning, and missing 2 days feels natural. Trust erodes through small betrayals that compound into destroyed relationships. Stupidity, left unchecked, multiplies. Smart investors understand this asymmetry deeply. They focus more energy on avoiding stupidity than seeking brilliance. One catastrophic mistake can erase decades of careful compounding, which is why the truly wealthy are obsessed with what not to do. Look at the businesses that failed after decades of success. They didn't collapse because competitors were brilliant. They collapsed because management did something actively stupid, over-leveraged the balance sheet, expanded outside their competence, made an acquisition that destroyed value. One terrible decision interrupted decades of positive compounding. The same pattern shows up everywhere. Healthy people who ignore small health problems until they compound into chronic disease. Wealthy people who make one leveraged bet that bankrupts them. Successful careers destroyed by one ethical lapse that compounds into scandal. Negative compounding accelerates faster than positive compounding, which is why avoiding it matters more than maximizing gains. This is why great investors maintain what they call avoid at all costs. Not lists of what to do, but lists of what never to do under any circumstances. No investment outside their circle of competence. No leverage that could threaten survival. No panic selling during market crashes. These aren't suggestions, they're absolute rules that protect against negative compounding. Human psychology makes patience almost impossible. The brain evolved for immediate threats and quick rewards, not for waiting 40 years to see if a strategy works. Everyone wants results now, validation now, proof now that they're on the right path. This impatience creates a predictable pattern. People start something promising, see no dramatic results in months or years, convince themselves they're on the wrong path, switch to something new, and restart the compounding process from zero. They do this repeatedly for decades. Meanwhile, the patient few who picked something reasonable and stuck with it end up with extraordinary results, not because they were smarter or luckier, but because they never interrupted the compounding. That's the entire secret, and it's agonizingly boring. Watch what happens when markets decline by 20%. Rational long-term investors understand this is temporary noise that doesn't interrupt compounding. But most people panic, sell at the bottom, wait for clarity, and miss the recovery. They interrupt their compounding precisely when patience matters most. The same psychology destroys careers. Someone spends 3 years learning a complex field, sees colleagues in different fields appearing to advance faster, switches careers entirely, and restarts their compounding from zero. 10 years later, they've sampled 5 different careers without achieving mastery in any, while the patient person who stuck with one has compounded expertise into genuine authority. Modern culture actively fights against patience. Social media shows constant highlights from other people's lives, creating the illusion that everyone else is progressing faster. Financial media celebrates quick gains and ignores slow compounding. Self-help gurus promise transformation in 90 days. All of it teaches the exact opposite of what actually works, which is picking something worthwhile and refusing to quit for decades. Money compounds in obvious ways that everyone understands, but knowledge compounds in ways that create permanent advantages, and almost nobody pays attention to this. Someone who learns one new mental model per month for 30 years has 360 different ways to think about problems. That accumulated knowledge doesn't just add up, it multiplies together. The person who understands mathematics, psychology, economics, history, and biology can see patterns invisible to specialists. They make fewer mistakes, spot opportunities earlier, and compound their judgment over time. The learning machines compound wisdom daily. They go to bed slightly wiser than they woke up, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Eventually, they're operating at a level that appears genius to others, but is really just compound learning over sufficient time. Consider what happens with real expertise. A doctor who reads medical journals for 30 years doesn't just know 30 years worth of facts. Each new piece of knowledge connects to previous knowledge, creating networks of understanding that enable pattern recognition impossible for beginners. The compounding creates judgment that cannot be taught, only accumulated. The same principle applies to any field worth knowing. An investor who studies business failures for decades develops an instinct for warning signs that newer investors miss. A writer who reads great literature daily for years absorbs techniques they couldn't articulate but deploy unconsciously. A craftsman who practices their craft for 40 years makes decisions in seconds that novices couldn't make in hours. This is why education never stops for successful people. They're not learning to accumulate credentials or impress others. They're compounding their mental models, building a lattice work of understanding that improves their judgment permanently. Each book, each experience, each mistake analyzed adds to the foundation and compounds with everything that came before. But here's the catch that most people miss. Knowledge only compounds if it's actually integrated and used. Reading a book and forgetting it produces no compounding. Attending a seminar and changing nothing produces no compounding. Accumulating facts without connecting them to mental models produces no compounding. The learning has to be active, connected, and applied to generate compound returns. Modern culture glorifies activity. People mistake motion for progress, busyness for productivity, constant pivoting for adaptability. They trade stocks frequently, switch jobs every 2 years, reinvent themselves constantly, convinced that standing still means falling behind. This is exactly backward. The biggest returns in life come from identifying something worthwhile and then doing almost nothing, just letting time work. The best investors make a handful of decisions per decade. The wealthiest people found one great business and held it for life. But sitting still feels wrong. It generates no stories, no excitement, no sense of control. So people create unnecessary activity to soothe their anxiety, interrupting compounding in the process. They confuse patience with passivity, not understanding that patient waiting is the most aggressive strategy of all. Look at the trading records of amateur investors. Constant activity, dozens of trades per year, always convinced the next move will be the one that generates wealth. The reality? All that activity produces returns below simply buying an index fund and doing nothing. The hyperactivity doesn't create wealth, it destroys compounding through fees, taxes, and mistimed decisions. The professional investors with the best track records do the opposite. They make one or two significant decisions per year, maybe fewer. They find businesses they understand, verify the price is reasonable, buy them, and then proceed to do essentially nothing for years or decades. The inactivity isn't laziness, it's the entire strategy. This pattern repeats outside investing. The most successful authors don't switch genres constantly. They master one and compound their audience over decades. The best craftsmen don't chase trends, they perfect their core skill until they're irreplaceable. The strongest relationships aren't constantly redefined. They're sustained through boring, consistent behavior over time. Society celebrates people who pivot and reinvent themselves, treating consistency as stagnation. This is backwards. Constant reinvention prevents compounding. Every pivot restarts the clock. Every reinvention abandons accumulated advantages. The person who sticks with one path for 40 years while everyone else pivots every 5 years ends up somewhere nobody else can reach. Competence in a narrow domain compounds differently than scattered knowledge across many domains. The specialist who spends 40 years understanding one industry develops judgment that cannot be replicated by someone dabbling. Deep expertise creates compounding advantages that breadth never achieves. This is why wealthy investors focus on areas they understand completely and ignore everything else. They're not trying to know everything, they're trying to know a few things better than anyone else. That deep competence, compounded over decades, produces extraordinary results from ordinary opportunities. The amateur makes 100 investments across 10 industries, understanding none deeply. The professional makes 5 investments in one industry they comprehend completely. 40 years later, the professional has compounded judgment, relationships, and returns, while the amateur is still learning basics. Here's what actually happens with deep competence. The first year studying an industry, everything is confusing. The 5th year, patterns start emerging. The 10th year, judgment improves noticeably. The 20th year, intuition develops for what works and what doesn't. The 40th year, pattern recognition operates almost automatically, spotting opportunities and risks instantly. That progression is compounding. Each year builds on every previous year, creating a foundation of understanding that cannot be rushed or shortcut. Someone trying to spread their attention across 10 industries never reaches even the 10th year level in any of them, because the learning never compounds, it just accumulates superficially. The circle of competence concept is misunderstood by most people. They think it means staying in their lane timidly, never learning anything new. That's wrong. It means going so deep in chosen areas that compounding expertise creates permanent advantages, while ruthlessly avoiding areas where no such advantage exists. Warren Buffett understands insurance, banking, and consumer businesses deeply because he's studied them for 70 years. He doesn't invest in technology because he hasn't compounded that expertise. He's not avoiding it from fear. He's avoiding it because he understands that competence compounds, and he hasn't put in the decades required to compete in that domain. This principle applies everywhere. A surgeon who performs the same procedure thousands of times compounds skill until they're the best in the world at that procedure. A lawyer who specializes in one area of law for 40 years compounds judgment until they can see outcomes. Clients and opponents can't. Focus allows compounding. Dilution prevents it. Everyone focuses on rate of return. How much did you make this year? What's your annual percentage? Can you beat the market? These questions miss the most powerful variable entirely, which is time. Time is what turns adequate returns into fortunes and modest habits into transformed lives. The difference between compounding for 10 years versus 40 years isn't arithmetic, it's exponential. Someone earning 15% for 40 years ends up with 267 times their starting capital. That same person earning 25% for 10 years has less than 10 times their starting capital. Time matters more than rate. Yet people spend their lives optimizing for rate while ignoring time. They interrupt promising situations to chase slightly higher returns elsewhere. They restart their compounding clock repeatedly by switching strategies. They waste decades because they never understood which variable actually mattered. Consider the mathematics more carefully. A 30-year-old who invests $10,000 at 15% annually has $1.6 million by age 70. That's adequate but unspectacular performance sustained over sufficient time, producing extraordinary results. The person who waits until age 50 to start, even earning 20%, ends up with only $383,000. Starting earlier matters far more than earning higher returns. This is why successful investors focus obsessively on not losing money. It's not about maximizing gains, it's about preserving capital so time can work. Every major loss restarts the compounding clock. Lose 50% and you need 100% just to break even. That lost time never comes back, which is why avoiding major mistakes matters more than catching every opportunity. The same principle explains why wealthy families stay wealthy across generations. They're not brilliant investors earning spectacular returns. They're competent stewards earning adequate returns without interruption across decades or centuries. The time does the work, but only if they don't sabotage the compounding through stupidity or impatience. Look at what time does to small differences. The gap between 12% and 15% seems trivial. Over 40 years, 12% turns 10,000 into 930,000. 15% turns that same 10,000 into 2.6 million. The 3% difference compounds into almost 3 times the ending wealth, but only because nothing interrupted it for 4 decades. Compounding isn't limited to financial assets. Reputation compounds. Every kept promise makes the next promise more valuable. Relationships compound. Decades of trust create bonds that new relationships can never replicate. Wisdom compounds. Experience accumulated over time creates judgment that youth cannot match. Bad things compound too, often faster. One lie makes the next lie easier. Skipping one workout makes skipping the next workout natural. Tolerating one toxic person invites more toxic people into life. Debt compounds against you, with interest making each payment harder than the last. Successful people understand this completely. They're ruthless about protecting their compounding in all areas. They avoid situations that interrupt their positive compounding and immediately eliminate anything that compounds negatively. Most people do the opposite, protecting what feels urgent and neglecting what actually compounds. Think about reputation carefully. One ethical lapse might seem insignificant, easily rationalized as necessary or harmless, but it compounds. The next ethical compromise comes easier. Trust erodes incrementally. Eventually, the reputation built over decades collapses, and rebuilding it proves impossible, because reputation compounds slowly in the positive direction, but collapses instantly in the negative. Physical health compounds similarly. Small daily choices about food, exercise, and sleep seem inconsequential individually. Compounded over 40 years, they determine whether someone enters old age vigorous and independent or broken and dependent. The body keeps score, and the interest rate on health decisions is punishingly high. Relationships compound through consistency. The friend who shows up reliably for 30 years has bonds that new friends can never match, regardless of how exciting or interesting those new friends are. The marriage sustained through boring faithfulness over decades creates intimacy impossible in new relationships. Time plus consistency compounds into something irreplaceable. Skills compound through practice. The musician who practices daily for 20 years reaches mastery that weekend hobbyists never approach. The writer who writes every day for a decade develops a voice that sporadic writing can't produce. The craftsman who works their craft for 40 years achieves intuition that shortcuts can't replicate. Even small habits compound powerfully. Reading 30 minutes daily equals roughly 200 books per decade. That's 2,000 books over 50 years of reading. The accumulated knowledge, perspective, and wisdom from 2,000 books compounds into a mental framework that shapes everything, all from 30 minutes daily, never interrupted. The biggest threat to compounding isn't bad luck or market crashes. It's doing something actively stupid that destroys the entire chain. One terrible decision, one moment of catastrophic judgment, one completely avoidable mistake, and decades of careful compounding evaporates. This is why great investors focus obsessively on avoiding stupidity rather than seeking brilliance. They maintain lists of behaviors guaranteed to cause disaster, and they simply refuse to do those things. No leverage that could bankrupt them, no investments outside their competence, no panic selling during downturns. Intelligence is overrated. Temperament is everything. The person who never does anything stupid, who protects their compounding from interruption, who sits patiently while others panic, that person wins. Not through brilliance, but through the systematic avoidance of self-inflicted harm. Look at the major financial disasters of the past century. Long-term capital management didn't fail because markets were unpredictable. They failed because brilliant people used leverage that could bankrupt them, which is just stupid. The housing crisis didn't happen because mortgages stopped working. It happened because people borrowed amounts they couldn't repay, which is just stupid. Individual investors make the same mistakes repeatedly. They use leverage, turning 20% losses into complete wipeouts. They invest in businesses they don't understand, hoping complexity hides opportunity. They panic during downturns, selling after crashes and buying after rallies. None of this requires bad luck. It's all self-inflicted stupidity. The truly wealthy have systems to prevent stupid decisions. They never let themselves get into positions where one bad outcome destroys them. They maintain liquidity so they never have to sell at bad times. They invest only in situations they understand completely. They follow checklists to avoid emotional decisions. All of this protects their compounding from their own worst impulses. Avoiding stupidity sounds simple but proves agonizingly difficult in practice. The stupid decision often disguises itself as opportunity, cleverness, or ambition. Everyone else is making money on this, why not me? I can handle more risk than average people. This time is different. These thoughts precede most catastrophic decisions. The antidote is systematic. Maintain absolute rules that cannot be violated regardless of how attractive the violation appears. No exceptions for special circumstances. No flexibility for once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. The rules exist specifically to prevent the stupid decisions that compound stupidity attracts. When emotion runs high. The compounding process is uncomfortable because it demands faith in something invisible. Results lag so far behind effort that the connection feels broken. Someone compounds wisdom for 5 years and sees no obvious payoff, so they question if it's working at all. This doubt creates interruption. People abandon promising paths because they can't see progress fast enough. They switch strategies repeatedly, looking for something that provides quicker validation. Each switch restarts their compounding, ensuring they never accumulate enough time for exponential growth to kick in. The successful few understand that compounding feels like nothing is happening for years, then suddenly everything happens at once. They trust the mathematics even when the results aren't visible. They continue showing up, making small improvements, and refusing to interrupt the process, regardless of how slowly it seems to work. Here's what the compounding curve actually looks like. Years 1 through 10 show minimal visible progress. Someone investing consistently sees their wealth grow, but it still looks small, insignificant, not worth the effort. This is when most people quit, convinced the strategy isn't working. Years 10 through 20 show more progress, but it's still mostly linear growth from contributions rather than exponential growth from compounding. The person who stuck with it has a decent portfolio now, but it doesn't feel miraculous. Many people quit here too, switching to strategies that promise faster results. Years 20 through 30 is when compounding starts becoming obvious. The returns on accumulated capital start exceeding new contributions. The growth accelerates visibly. The person who made it this far without interrupting finally sees why patience matters. But most people never reach this point because they interrupted earlier. Years 30 through 40 is when compounding produces results that appear magical to outsiders. The wealth grows faster each year than most people earn in their entire careers. Passive returns exceed active income. The person who compounded consistently for 4 decades has wealth that seems impossible to people who kept restarting their clock. The same pattern appears in any domain. The writer who publishes consistently for 20 years seems to suddenly become an overnight success. The entrepreneur who built their business steadily for 30 years seems to suddenly get discovered. The craftsman who perfected their skill for 40 years seems to suddenly command premium prices. None of it is sudden, it's compounding finally becoming visible. The best way to understand compounding is to invert it. Ask what compounds against you. What eats away at your resources over time? What multiplies your disadvantages instead of your advantages? Most people never ask this question seriously, so they let destructive forces compound unnoticed for decades. Credit card debt compounds against you, turning small purchases into permanent drains. Bad relationships compound against you, making each interaction more toxic than the last. Ignorance compounds against you as missed learning opportunities stack up. Procrastination compounds against you as delayed decisions become harder decisions. Smart people eliminate these negative compounders ruthlessly. They pay off debt immediately. They exit toxic relationships without hesitation. They learn continuously to fight intellectual decay. They make decisions promptly to avoid accumulation of avoided problems. They understand that eliminating negative compounding matters more than adding positive compounding. Think about what compounds negatively in typical lives. Small monthly subscriptions that go unexamined compound into thousands annually. Slightly excessive eating compounds into obesity and disease. Minor dishonesty compounds into corrupted character. Avoided difficult conversations compound into destroyed relationships. None of these feel significant individually, but compounded over decades, they destroy lives. The inversion perspective also reveals opportunity. What are competitors or peers allowing to compound against them? If everyone in an industry tolerates inefficiency, the person who eliminates it compounds advantages. If everyone in a profession stops learning after graduation, the person who keeps learning compounds expertise. Negative compounding in others creates opportunity for those who avoid it. Consider the compound effect of small inefficiencies. A business with 5% higher costs than competitors doesn't notice it initially. Over 20 years, that 5% difference compounds into a massive competitive disadvantage. The efficient business compounds its advantage through reinvesting savings, eventually dominating the industry, while the inefficient business wonders what happened. The same logic applies to personal productivity. Someone who wastes 1 hour daily to distractions loses 365 hours annually. Over a 40-year career, that's 14,600 hours, equivalent to 7 full years of work time. The person who eliminates that waste compounds 7 years of additional productive time into their career. Health behaviors compound negatively with particular brutality. Smoking 1 pack daily for 40 years doesn't just cost money. It compounds into destroyed health and years of life lost. Being 20 pounds overweight doesn't just affect appearance. It compounds into joint problems, heart disease, and reduced longevity. Small negative health choices compound into catastrophic outcomes. Great investment results come mostly from sitting and doing nothing. This sounds absurd to people trained to believe that effort creates results. But in compounding, the effort happens up front in selecting what to compound. Then the results come from leaving it alone. The best investment track records have the same characteristic. Very few decisions. Very long holding periods, very boring daily activity. Buy a wonderful business at a fair price, then sit for decades while it compounds. Resist every temptation to trade it, improve it, or outsmart it. Just sit. This is harder than it sounds. The urge to do something, anything, is overwhelming during market volatility. Colleagues are trading actively and talking about their moves. Financial media is screaming about opportunities missed and dangers lurking. The brain insists that inaction is irresponsible, but compounding requires exactly this kind of inaction. Every trade introduces costs, commissions, spreads, taxes, and opportunity cost. More importantly, every trade risks replacing a wonderful business held at a low-cost basis with something inferior. The trades feel productive but destroy compounding. The mathematics proves this definitively. An investor who bought an index fund in 1980 and never sold has vastly more wealth than investors who tried to time the market, switch between sectors, or trade actively. The passive investor paid no taxes on gains for 40 years, allowing compounding to work without interruption. The active investor paid taxes constantly, restarting their compounding with each trade. Sitting is the most aggressive strategy available because it allows maximum compounding. Nothing interrupts the process. No taxes reset the clock. No mistakes interrupt the chain. No activity costs eat into returns. Just pure, uninterrupted mathematical compounding for as long as possible. This is why successful investors talk about their sit-on-your-ass approach. They're not being lazy or passive. They're being ruthlessly focused on maximizing compounding by eliminating everything that interrupts it. The appearance of passivity masks the most aggressive compounding strategy possible. First decision, identify what's worth compounding and commit completely. This isn't about finding the perfect opportunity. It's about finding something good enough and giving it sufficient time to work. Most people waste decades searching for perfect when good enough, plus 40 years beats perfect plus 10 years. Second decision, protect that compounding from all threats, internal and external. External threats include market crashes, competition, and changing conditions. Internal threats include impatience, doubt, boredom, and the illusion that switching strategies will accelerate results. The internal threats are far more dangerous. Third decision, expand the concept beyond money to everything that actually matters. Compound your learning daily. Compound your relationships through consistent behavior over decades. Compound your reputation through reliable action. Compound your health through sustainable habits. Money is just one form of compounding, and not even the most important one. These three decisions sound simple but prove agonizing in practice. Committing completely to one path means accepting that other paths won't be explored. Protecting that commitment from internal threats means fighting your own psychology constantly. Expanding beyond money means caring about things that show results even slower than financial compounding. But this is how extraordinary results actually happen. Pick something worthwhile. Protect it from interruption. Give it sufficient time. Refuse to restart. Apply this to skills, relationships, health, learning, and wealth. Wait decades longer than feels comfortable. Trust mathematics over emotion. The alternative is what most people do. Sample everything. Commit to nothing. Interrupt constantly. Restart repeatedly. And wonder why decades of activity produced mediocre results. They mistook motion for progress and busyness for compounding. They never understood that the most powerful force available to them required sitting still. Understanding how compounding really works means accepting that extraordinary results come from ordinary actions sustained over uncommon time periods. There's no secret, no trick, no shortcut that bypasses the requirement for patience. The mathematics works for everyone, but almost nobody can endure the waiting. The path is unglamorous. Show up consistently. Avoid stupidity. Protect your compounding from interruption. Trust mathematics over emotion. Wait longer than feels comfortable. Refuse to restart the clock unnecessarily. These actions are simple but agonizingly difficult to sustain for decades. This is why wealth concentrates among so few. Not because they're smarter or more talented, but because they understood compound mathematics deeply enough to never interrupt it. They traded the emotional satisfaction of constant activity for the mathematical certainty of patient accumulation. And 40 years later, the results look like magic to people who never understood the difference between motion and progress. The unglamorous path offers no validation along the way. No one celebrates the person who made a good decision and then proceeded to do nothing for 30 years. No media profiles the investor who bought stocks in 1980 and never sold. No awards honor the person who showed up to work every day for 4 decades without drama or reinvention. But the results speak eventually. The person who compounded consistently, avoided stupidity, and refused to interrupt their process ends up somewhere extraordinary. Not through brilliance or luck, but through respecting mathematical principles that everyone knows but almost nobody follows. This is the deepest truth about compounding that nobody wants to hear. It requires doing boring things consistently for periods of time so long that the connection between action and result feels broken. It requires faith in mathematics when emotions scream otherwise. It requires patience in a culture that celebrates speed. Most people can't do it. They'll try for a few years, see minimal results, and switch to something else. They'll repeat this pattern for decades, always looking for the system that produces faster results, never understanding that the system they keep abandoning was the only one that could have worked. The few who understand this completely make different choices. They pick something good enough, commit completely, protect it from interruption, and wait. They ignore market noise, peer pressure, and their own impatience. They understand that compounding is the most powerful force available to them, but only if they never interrupt it. 40 years later, the results appear magical to outsiders. Massive wealth from modest beginnings, extraordinary expertise from daily practice, unshakable relationships from consistent behavior, perfect health from boring habits. All of it is just compounding, allowed to work without interruption for sufficient time. This is how it really works, not through secrets or advantages or brilliance, through respecting mathematical principles that require uncomfortable patience, through avoiding stupidity more carefully than seeking genius, through protecting the compounding process from every threat, especially the internal ones, through waiting longer than anyone else will wait because the mathematics demands it. The choice is simple but brutal. Embrace the unglamorous path of patient compounding, or spend decades chasing glamorous shortcuts that never work. Most people choose shortcuts and get mediocre results. The few who choose patience get extraordinary results. The mathematics doesn't care about feelings, it only cares about consistency and time.